Welcome, everybody, to our ninth episode of the Community Health and Capital podcast, supported by the Notting Hills Community Interest Company, supporting work in Ringland, east of Newport. I'm really pleased to have us today with us Dr. Connie Youngans. Hi, Connie.
Hi.
Connie's agreed to do a podcast about community health workers and what they could potentially do to support new ways of working in primary care, but also in kind of local neighbourhood services. So thanks for joining us, Connie. We're really pleased to have you here today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Connie is managing to squeeze this podcast into a very busy Monday. I think she's transmitting this live from a nursing home visit. I think you were on today during your lunch break. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. It's always a
Um,
pleasure.
Thank you. So, Connie, just before we talk about the subject, obviously, really, tell us how you wandered into this role that you're in just now, and what's your background.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm a GP by training. I've got a bit of a public health background. So I did a PhD in epidemiology and medical statistics first, and then trained in graduate medicine. And so I've got an interest both in public health and primary care, and I feel that primary care is really well suited to prevention and um, community care. So this is kind of what my basic interest was, and then I became really interested in social prescribing because sometimes, particularly when you've had a job in A&E, it feels a bit like you're putting a plaster on, and it's the revolving door. People, like Michael Marmot says, you fix people up as best as you can, and then you discharge them back into the community, um, into the conditions that made them sick in the first place. So I'm really interested in the wider determinants of health, and I met Matt Harris in 2019, who was talking about the community health workers in Brazil, and it immediately made sense to me that this is a role that we could really do with, and that's how I became involved, and we got the first community health and wellbeing worker pilot off the ground. So they're called community health and wellbeing workers. They call themselves Chewies, and we saw really remarkable change. And I think I really understood for the first time what it is that we're sometimes up against. And don't really understand when we're sitting in primary care. So I'm a great advocate for this model, and I think I would love to see it expanded.
Thanks, Connie. Matt kindly did a podcast for us, I think a good few weeks back now, about innovation, reverse innovation, frugal innovation, I suppose, talking about the subject of his book that we have hyped and promoted, obviously, by now. Um, I seem to remember the first time I met Matt was going back to talking about the pace of innovation in the healthcare system in the UK, probably about 2007, 2008 in the
Mm.
RCGP conference when he was back trying to get some support for the idea of this. So tell us
Mm.
about community health workers in a nutshell and what do they do?
Yeah, so they're a little bit different to what we're used to in the UK. And so we call it the Chewy principle that they follow. So Chewy stands for C for comprehensive at the household level, um, H for hyperlocal, people from the community for that community, trained and paid, U for universal, so everybody in their geographical patch gets seen regardless of need. And I'll hopefully come to why that's important, even though that's one of the things that people pick up on and go, we don't need universal, the rising tide lifts all boats, we need to be targeted. But I've come to the realization that that actually is hindering rather than helping. So universal at the household level, and I is for integrated into primary care, the voluntary sector, and the local authority. What they do is they are part of, we see them as part of the medical team. They go out and see about 120 households once a month. We're not there yet, so the ideal, so their caseload, as you if you like, is 120 households in a certain area. So they look after buildings or streets. um, they try to engage 120 households get to know them, and then visit them regularly. In the pilot, it took us a year and a half to reach about 60% of the population. In Brazil, the coverage is something around 70%, and I think sometimes maybe that's where it stays because of transients and people working night shift, etc. But the idea is that there's the work is the ongoing engagement. So door knocking is a big part of their process to try and engage people, and I think that is kind of the secret sauce why they reach people and engage with them. They are, if you like, agenda free. So they turn up and they want to get to know the household. They introduce themselves as part of the GP practice, but also part of the community, and explain their role. They can help with all sorts of things. And Fleur de Meyer, who's a street doctor and GP and professor in Holland, she calls this precision community medicine. And I really love this term because that's exactly what it is. So you start with the household in front of you, and you make anything your concern that is their concern. So you start with the patient, not with the agenda, as it's often in our case. We start with we need to get this person to have a blood pressure. How do we make this happen? And so their priority is building relationships with the households. The second job that they have, apart from building good relationships with their residents, is building good relationships with their people on the patch, so the professionals around them, because they are people from the community for the community. They are trained in some way, so they do all the training that normal NHS employees would do. So they safeguarding, patient confidentiality, information governance, all of those things and more, basic public health, learning about vaccinations, cancer screening, so they can give advice. But they have no requirement for technical skills, so they are recruited on characteristics, on character rather than characteristics, I should say. So we're looking for people who are passionate for their community, who are integral, honest, good communicators, culturally competent, emotionally intelligent, problem solving, and good team workers. And then any skill that they don't have, they bring in. So they have good relationships with their GPs, with the community matrons, the social prescribers, the health and wellbeing coaches, and anybody else who's got technical skills that might be needed. And what I love about this model is that they approach who is appropriate for that family in front of them and who's available at the time. So it's, Matt calls it the right time for the right person all the time. So you don't have a waiting list of 8 weeks before you get to see a health visitor or something. They will make sure that whatever is needed at the moment is that need is going to be met to the best of their ability. They don't work in isolation. They meet with me once a week to discuss tricky patients. They talk to each other in the team, and they consult people with the right skills around them. In Westminster, we were very lucky that we've got 29 community health workers in the north and the south, in some of the areas covering the most deprived areas in Westminster. And in Westminster, our integrated neighbourhood team took inspiration from the community health worker model. Dr. Saul Kaufman, who is one of the clinical directors, was really impressed with their ability to be flexible and work in the liminal spaces between services to kind of help their residents. And so he created the Octopus, which is our integrated neighborhood team in Westminster. And the idea is that you've got 8 tentacles, which is our 8 frontline roles. And they have suckers, they stick. So they won't leave the patient alone until a problem is solved. So there's none of this buck passing that often goes on, shunting work to another service, or you sort this out first and then I sort that out, or can you re-refer, or anything like that. So they are available, they're present, and they stay present. They also, I didn't know this about cephalopods, but the tentacles think independently, so they've got a different nervous system.
Yes.
So this is also an inspiration that they think independently, they have agency, control, and belonging, so ABC. And and they've got three hearts. So I'm going to stop talking about octopus in a minute, but the BCS, the local authority, and uh, the NHS. Yeah, did I say that? Voluntary sector, NHS, and local authority. So this kind of wraparound, the systems wrapping around this role is really needed, and I think it's one of the things that's going to make it work in our locality is that everybody links in with this model.
Interesting. No, I was going to come in a second if it's okay, kind of to the pace of it being spread seems to be picking up, and I'm sure there's some
Mm.
reasons for that we can come to. I was also going to use my interjection there to comment that we had a little bit of a talk before this podcast, hadn't we, about the kind of trademarks around Star Wars terminology, hadn't we, around Chewies and things, really, which you could either use to your advantage or it could either land you in a lot of mess. I really like the term precision community medicine, and in a way it seems to co-opt, maybe deliberately or not, otherwise the precision medicine is often something with
Yeah,
technology. We're talking about kind of hyper scientific approaches.
yeah,
Interestingly, this almost flies in the face of the general direction of travel of healthcare in general, particularly in primary care, which is away from relationship-based care, which is
yeah,
away from continuity of care, which is away from trying to support the whole person. Services becoming fragmented.
yeah.
What what benefits now you've had this for? How long have you had it for? I think in West
3 years.
3 years. So,
Yeah.
I mean, as a clinician, but also the benefits you see to your patients.
Mm.
What do you think it's managed to achieve?
I think it's, for me, it's the way forward, and I hear what you're saying about the direction of travel. I think we've got ourselves into a bit of a transactional mess, actually, in the way we do things, and we do it in the name of efficiency, but it's almost kind of run away a bit from us. So you might have heard about NHS pilotitis. This is what we see all the time, and it's also what harms this model, or stops it from being implemented, because commissioners think in 6 monthly, 12 monthly cycles, and you look at it with kind of slightly unreasonable KPIs, then you go, oh, it's not really working. You stop doing something, and nobody really looks at the cost of stopping something. And with this model, actually, you can't just do what we normally do with services. We kind of like increase the eligibility criteria, we make it a bit tighter, less people get seen, but nobody really notices. But when you offer a universal model that everybody is eligible for, it's quite difficult to justify that you're doing it for some people, not for others, or that there is a higher need, because they uncover unmet need. I think when we talk about need, we always talk about the need that we know about.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But actually, what we've discovered with the community health workers is that there's huge amount of need in the community that's not known about and that we're not dealing with. So we're starting with a kind of survivor bias, if you like. Those people who make it and register with the practice are included, and then those who turn up to their appointments, they're even more included because we know stuff about them.
And people don't know what to do with that need sometimes, really, do they? I think a lot of
Yeah,
people still don't quite know what they are permitted or entitled to bring up in a
yeah,
primary care appointment, never mind anywhere else. But
that's right.
primary care is the last buck sometimes when other
Yeah,
services have had to do exactly what you've said around
yeah.
tightening eligibility, putting in place more conditions.
Yeah, exactly. And also I talk a bit about that, the moral injury that we feel as GPs when people come to us and there's so much need and there's so little that we can do. And for me, the community health and wellbeing workers have kind of reinvigorated my own love for primary care, because you can see how really tiny differences that they make to people's lives that seem almost trivial to us as GPs. So we're kind of also, this is another thing that we kind, the values that we have in the NHS are all around sort of the sharp end of, saving lives, and restarting someone's heart, and giving drugs, and those little things that actually make a much bigger difference upstream,
Mm.
are not really valued. And I think that's where they make a difference. So housing letters, we write so many, they probably go in the bin, I'm not sure, or maybe if they don't go
Who
in the bin,
knows?
maybe
Right.
that's a bit
Yeah.
harsh, but um they, unless you write a really impassioned, and even then it it often doesn't shift the dial much because of the great housing need. And what the community health wellbeing workers are able to do is they are kind of mediators in their place. They become advocates and allies. They they take the kind of line on a spreadsheet and housing and turn it into a story. They talk to people about why they really can't move that family, what's going on for them, and what options might be possible. And sometimes it's kind of sitting down, and we all know this. If you take time with a patient and you bring other people in, you have a good MDT, things get unstuck, but often we don't have time for that. So so the community health workers have the benefit of time, and they have the benefit of good relationships. And coming back to what I was saying earlier, so in response to the question of what tangible benefits we've seen, in the pilot, we saw a 7% drop in unscheduled GP visits. Instead of the tidal wave of unmet need we were worried about uncovering with the community health workers, which was kind of one of the reasons why GPs weren't initially enthusiastic about this role, because we just know that there's so much more need out there that we can meet already. GPs are in demand, we workload is rising. There's a there was a 47% increase in the likelihood of having the vaccinations you're eligible for, 82% increase in the likelihood of cancer screening and NHS health checks. And to me, that's not a surprise. So we're doing a randomized trial now in the expanded teams in Westminster to see if we can replicate this from the pilot. But to me, it makes complete sense, because what I've discovered is that our kind of transactional way of dealing with things, we see that there's an area that has low vaccination rates. We then think we know what's needed. We create a service around it, or we increase communication around it. But often there things that stop people from having vaccinations that we don't know about, or that they don't tell us about, that are a bit more subtle. And it's only when you build those relationships that you find out that actually they didn't know it was free, or they were worried about things that they felt shame about, that they couldn't really disclose, and disclosing to the community health worker after 6 months of knowing them. So a lot of those things, relationships take time. They're a bit unpredictable, and we often feel that's not efficient. But actually, once you've got this relationship in place with the community health and wellbeing worker, and they're part of the practice, they become a catalyst for all sorts of transactions that work much better, because there's a trusted relationship in place. I was inspired by Hilary Cottam's book Radical Help. I don't know if you've come across it, but that also really resonates with me now that I see how the community health and wellbeing workers work. So Hilary Cottam talks about the fact that 80% of our resources are spent on processes now, tick boxes, systems, and only 20% on actual people. And she said we need to reverse that ratio. We need to spend 80% on people, 20% on systems to support it. And so I think investing in people in the community, I have this garden analogy. I feel you give it a little bit of water and nourishment and protection, and you get spades back. And our community health and wellbeing workers are, some of them are part-time. They work 27 hours, 30 hours a week, but then they'll be maternity champion on the weekend and clock up 50 hours in volunteering time. They often do a lot more than is required, because we also trust them. So there's no micromanagement. We don't. They have a GPS way of tracking each other where they are, so that they're safe. That's a big issue that often comes up. Is it safe to go into homes? How do you deal with that as a lone worker? They're not lone working. They are lone working in the sense that they go and see residents on their own, but they will go in pairs if they're not sure. They're in constant communication with other professionals. So they'll check with a GP if they're worried about something. They've got access to the medical notes, and that's really important. So they get consent from the patient to do that. Their principle is kind of nothing about you without you.
Mm-hmm.
So if they discuss their case with somebody else, they'll get permission from the resident to disclose that. They won't do anything that the resident doesn't want them to do. So if the resident says, "I don't want you to let the GP about that," don't let them know about that, then they won't, because they say we're the GP's eyes and ears, were ears and eyes, were not the spies.
Mm-hmm.
so
Mm-hmm.
so that's a really important principle of their trust with the resident, that they are first and foremost there for the household.
I'm loving the metaphors, Connie. I can't keep up with them. Um, I remember getting back in contact with Matt, I think when COVID first hit, really, because there was this whole argument at the time, wasn't there, around centralized versus decentralized contact
Yeah,
tracing, and in a crisis, how much have you got the capacity to engage properly on a
yeah,
local level? And I
yeah,
think you won't be surprised to hear, I'm sure it's been said by others as well, that Matt was very much of the view that if we'd had this, I don't think army is a fair use of the kind of military kind of language really, but if you had
mm,
this huge network of people already
yeah,
embedded in teams, doing that kind of reaching across into public health space, but also into primary care,
absolutely.
we know in other countries that they manage to have value really, but it seems to
Mm.
have been that, as I say, the pace of this spread and adoption for this model has really picked up since the pandemic. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, yeah. So we've got 23 sites locally that are trying this model. I think a lot of this is owed to the efforts of the National Association of Primary Care, and I just want to acknowledge that, because we had a visit by Hilary Cotton, which we were hugely excited about, and she talked to us about the difficulty of scaling and innovation. She she said the word scaling is kind of the wrong word. What you want to use is propagation, propagating a model. And the propagation I like, because it suggests an analogy of a sort of tender plant that you know replant elsewhere and allow it to grow. And um she a lot of her initiatives were sort of a little bit stuck, because everybody wanted her advice to get it going, and we couldn't have done it without the NAPC. I mean, Matt and I talk a lot to other sides. We now are in a good position that our original Chewies, we have the four, uh, Maureen, Nahima, Asma, and Comfort, who are now kind of consultants for other sites. So they go out and speak to other community health workers about how to do it. They're producing a handbook together. The NAPC has organized the first Chewy conference on Friday, actually, where they all come together to talk about, and they've invited colleagues from Brazil to talk to them about how they work. So there's a lot of effort going into getting this role supported, because it can be really lonely in the community if you're left alone with such an overwhelming need. And I think they need a lot of support and hand holding, because they're lay people from the community. So that's really important. And I feel like we're at that stage now where I think people are cottoning on to the need for a model like this. Like you say, in the pandemic, if you ask the community health workers now, how many people in your households are pregnant, how many have diabetes, how many have COPD, how many have housing issues, they could tell you off the top of their head. And I think this is what we could have really done with during COVID, knowing who isn't able to support themselves, who needs extra help. um, but they do need the support of the system around them. So I'm grateful that the NEPC is now, they have a share point where they share our resources also from other sides. So Cornwall have really grabbed this model and have gone big with that, investing their health and equalities money under Donna Chapman. And so so yeah, so they also provide their resources and share that with other sites. And we have a community of practice that meets quarterly, where we talk to all the sites and exchange knowledge and resources. So it's a real sharing economy, if you like.
Interesting. I think I guess it's normal at this point you start to ask what challenges you faced, but I can only guess
Yeah.
that would take us into another several podcast episodes. I think we'd have to go through them, but I suppose just to kind of briefly talk from the perspective of people that might have some hesitancy or some kind of concerns about the
Mm,
model. I just had a
mm,
few kind of thoughts. I mean, it was really interesting, your evaluation obviously honed in on what are the benefits of the clinical system and the kind of clinical
mm,
benefits or traditional primary care benefits, but I know a lot of the work is into that more unmet social
mm,
need. I'm sure, I think you've commented before that people immediately feedback, well, we're doing this with social prescribing. In a nutshell,
mm,
why would you disagree with that? And
mm.
what are your thoughts around kind of how
So
this compares?
I love social prescribing, and I'm a huge fan of social prescribing. But the devil is kind of in detail. I think our social prescribers, where they are operating, our link workers are adding huge value, and that's undisputed. And but the community health and wellbeing workers also do that kind of work, and I think the difference is in how they're implemented. So the community health and wellbeing workers don't have a caseload, they don't have referrals, and they don't have discharges. And I think if our community health workers were employed as social prescribing link workers, they would be constrained by the constraints of this role. So I know from our social prescribers that we work with quite closely in Westminster that they always have a waiting list that's bigger than they can manage. They're sometimes not based in the locality themselves, so they're not people from that community. So often they don't have the contextual knowledge, and they don't know whether that yoga class around the corner is actually still ongoing, who does it, and is it suitable for that particular patient. I think it's also kind of a little bit of a drop on a hot stone when you've got a community, and that's why we have community health and wellbeing workers in our most deprived areas, because when you've got um, such intersectionality and with wider determinants and so much need, having a social prescriber for 6 weeks might be okay for you and I, but it's not enough for people who have really complex needs. There's a trust issue. Often people don't even get referred in because for referral, people have to present to the GP. The GP has to recognize the need. The patient has to consent. So that already excludes quite a lot of people from the social prescribing link worker model, because what we've found is that they actually, a lot of people are sort of pre-contemplation on the motivational interview cycle when the community health worker talks to them. So they go like, well, we've got amazing health and wellbeing coaches, or we could you could talk to our social prescriber at length about sort of goal setting, and they go, no, that's not for me. Sorry. I've got bigger fish to fry, and I'm not interested in that kind of
Yeah,
thing.
interesting.
Or there's a language issue or a sort of cultural understanding that needs to, it's almost like the community health and wellbeing workers are warming them up to at some point engage with the health and wellbeing coaches or the social prescribers. But that's where our transactional referral based episodic care has its limits. And I think a lot of it happens over time. So we have many examples where somebody's not interested in their NHS health checks because they're just not interested, and then they have a scare about a cancer, and then 6 months later they go, oh, that test that you talk to me about, tell me about that again, because I think I need to take a better care of my health. Sometimes it's hand holding, going to an appointment with them, and these kind of like referral based services where you have a face-to-face session in a GP practice doesn't lend itself to that. So I think the limitations are not with social prescribing as such. So Bromley by Bow, they also do it slightly differently, and they're kind of like the inventors of social prescribing, if you like. Um, I like how Froome have phrased it, they call it compassionate communities, because social prescribing always suggests a little bit of a medical
It
model
does.
of
Yeah,
like,
it really does.
I'll give you a prescription for walking and then you'll be better. And the compassionate communities, I think, encapsulates much more what social prescribing actually is. It's about, helping people with their living conditions in a kind of longitudinal way.
I think I was starting to get a little bit of a feeling from you of kind of if you were to answer the question, kind of which one would you choose, community health workers or social prescribing? Because there is a finite pot. Which would it be? But I think that's maybe a little bit of debate to kind of go on for. Probably people listening to this can make up.
But can I interject there briefly, Johnny? Because I think often what we've come across in terms of challenges that you mentioned, it's that pitching one service against the other. So the community health workers are pitched against the community champions, the social prescribers against the Chewies. We're always thinking about what can we do less of, or what can we stop, or what we can replace with a better model. And I feel what we need is an ecosystem. And I mean, if I'm honest with you, I would probably like a community health worker, and I think the model that they have in Brazil is elegant, it's uncomplicated,
Mm-hmm.
and I think you can leverage so much on that one relationship. But in this service landscape that we find ourselves in the UK, if you just had community health workers in the bottom 20% most deprived areas, I think it would cost, Imperial looked at that, would cost 300 million a year just for those areas. And it's not to say that you don't need the social prescribers then, or the health and wellbeing coaches, but it's acknowledging that people need a different model where they don't have 15 services at once trying to get something from them, coming with some agenda. There needs to be a kind of a bit more reliable contact. But I think there's no reason why it can't be an ecosystem. Why can't, in areas that have less need, just be a social prescriber? If there was just a social prescriber, that would be fine, because that's probably adequate for that area. So I would like to start commissioners to think about the ecosystem of their boroughs and their locality, rather than a kind of a dichotomy that doesn't really help improve
No, I
care.
hear where you're coming from. You very elegantly, to use that word again, actually brought me to the kind of, if we can squeeze it in before the episode wraps up, I suppose, to use another metaphor, the elephant in the room with this really. But I think you've almost neutralised that question before I've asked it already around cost, because I'm just working out 300 million it was modelled to have
Mm,
a community health and wellbeing worker in the areas of greatest disadvantage
mm,
in England. What's the NHS England budget these days? It's about 120, 150 billion or something,
brilliant.
really.
Yeah,
10% of that ish goes to general
yeah,
practice. You've got 12 billion.
yeah.
It's not much money, is it? 300 million a
No,
year.
it really isn't. It isn't. But I think when you're faced with commissioning at a local level, it somehow seems to be safer, less risky, more attractive to spend smaller pots of money on targeting for impact. And that's kind of the model that we've gone with now. So we like targeting for impact, looking at high need, throwing money at it, but uh, it's not large sums. Whereas here you've got a universal approach that on the face of it costs quite a lot, right? Because you will need to pay more people. Instead of having one local area coordinator for the entire borough or something, you have 100 community health and wellbeing workers for Westminster, and that looks quite large on paper. But when you look at cost effectiveness and cost benefit, it kind of, to me, that intuitively makes sense that you have a better use of assets. Lots of people don't come to you. But the reason why it's so expensive and the budget is so tight at the moment is because we operate at the sharp end. So if we, yourself, if you have somebody who comes to you with advanced diabetes and they've already got peripheral neuropathy and kidney failure, there's very little you can do with diet advice at that stage in terms of quality of life and length of life. But if you found somebody who had an uncontrolled or a pre-diabetic risk HbA1c, and you intervened then, it would be very cheap and very successful. But we don't really have mechanisms in place to do that for everyone, because we wait for people to come to us. And so I think for me, the kind of the shift towards prevention, that we need to turn down the tap of demand. We had a master students look at modelling the return on investment in Westminster. It's a little bit old now, so that informed the pilot. It showed a £4 of investment, £4 return on every pound invested in the deprived areas, but even across the borough, it was £2 per pound invested. It probably has changed a bit now, because you know, we have less households than we thought we would have because of the great need. But the cost effectiveness analysis that we just did with a master student at Imperial showed that it was cost effective just on three. Sorry. It was cost effective on just three things: breast cancer screening, bowel cancer screening, and the other thing was MMR vaccinations. If the community health workers just did those three things, it would be cost effective in terms of life years saved. Now imagine all of the loads of other things that they do at the same time.
Yeah.
And so I think we probably need to make more of an argument about the cost effectiveness, looking at the whole picture and the whole system. And I think this is kind of where things are going now with the integrated care systems. That you're starting to think about a locality in its entirety, about adult social care, about children's care, about housing, primary care, secondary care, and we need to look at it holistically, because the community health and wellbeing workers operate in all of those spaces.
The octopus. Thank you, Connie. That has been so fascinating and so much detail in what you've described, and I think the immense amount of thinking that continues to go into this is really, it's really inspiring, actually. So thank you so much for joining. I know that you mentioned there is more research going on, which I'm sure some people listening will be keen to follow in the years to come. But where you mentioned the National Association, where should people go to, and who could they get in contact with if they wanted to kind of this in their area, or just interested generally, or?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Community Health and Wellbeing Worker landing page on the NAPC website. So the National Association of Primary Care, if you Google it and you Google community health workers, it'll come up with a landing page. It'll give you a bit of background about the role. And if you're really interested in taking this forward, you can contact the NAPC, and they give you access to the SharePoint, to the resources, if you're serious about trialing this. I would say it's really important to acknowledge that the 4 principles that I mentioned, the Chewie principles, have to be honoured, because if you're comprehensive but you're not hyperlocal, or you're not integrated, then you're doing something else. I mean, it might be amazing, but it's not the community health and wellbeing worker model from Brazil. So people have to kind of commit to this, to doing this model in its entirety, not targeted, not segmented, not just for children, not just for the elderly, not just for people that you know about. It has to be the Chewie model. But then the NAPC would be very happy to support it, and obviously also Imperial College London, which has been supporting this through the Applied Research Collaborative. So there's lots of support out there that the NAPC can put you in touch with.
Thank you, Connie. We'll make sure we put those links out in the podcast when it goes live. Thank you so much for joining. I know you need to get on your fold-up bike to go to your next meeting in a second. So thank you, Connie. We look forward to being in touch again as things develop. And yeah, this has been the 9th episode of the Community Health and Capital podcast. If you'd like to follow, we're on Spotify. Our website is www.19hills.org, and we look forward to coming back to you soon in a few weeks with another episode. Thank you, everybody.